Hey there, Alex Kidman here. Today taking a look at this, the Motorola Moto G34 5G. Yet another inexpensive Motorola phone. They sure do like making inexpensive phones, and the good news here is they like making fairly decent inexpensive Android phones, and that's exactly what the Motorola Moto G34 5G is. Price-wise, it sits rather predictably between the G24 and the G54 5G. G54 5G was one of my favourite phones of recent times in that budget space, and the G34 is a really interesting challenger to it. Let's get into why that is. So on the design side, the G34 5G is built around a 6.5-inch 120Hz capable LCD display, which might sound great for a phone at the $279 price point here in Australia, but there is a catch. And the catch is that the resolution is limited, 1600 by 720 pixels, basically meaning it's a 720p display. Now, 720p displays are not uncommon in this kind of price space, not uncommon at all. But comparatively, for example, the 54 is 1080p full. 1080p is a little bit nicer on screens this size. So yeah, you can certainly do your Netflix binges or watch YouTube or whatever it is you want to do on this phone, but not quite as crispy, not quite as brightly as you might. And of course, it's just an LCD, not an OLED, so the color reproduction isn't quite up there. But again, this is very much in line with its price. Lots of phones in this price bracket have screens that are only this quality, and quite a few of them quite a bit worse. So this is decent without being spectacular. Otherwise, the design is very much contemporary Motorola, with a hole punch array for the front-facing camera and slight bezels around all sides. Now, here in Australia, Motorola only sells the G34 5G in two different hues. Either charcoal black, which is your basic black phone, goes with everything, I guess, or ocean green. Ocean green has a vegan leather finish, and I've talked about this before. I don't like vegan leather. Vegan leather is not made out of vegans, people. It's made out of plastic, and I just don't like the feel of it. I really do like the green color. The green color is really nice, but the vegan leather feel, it sets something off of me, and I totally 100% accept this is a personal quirk that I don't like vegan leather. Maybe you're the same, maybe you're not. Let me know in the comments below what you think. Here's the thing though, doesn't really matter, and it doesn't really matter because they do provide a clear plastic case in the box with the G34, which means I don't have to touch the vegan leather at all, and I still get the nice color. That's a real win-win. I will always advocate for people putting cases on their phones. It's just simple protection that works. Do it. Now that's a win, but less of a win is that there are apparently ice blue and vanilla cream colors sold in some other markets. They're not for sale here in Australia. I do like me a blue phone, but I guess it's better than just being stuck with the basic black one, which is often what happens in these budget phone spaces. The controls on the Moto G34 5G are otherwise absolutely stock standard to what I've seen across Motorola phones recently for pretty much all of its handsets, which means you get a thin combined power button and fingerprint reader on the side just beneath a volume rocker. You get a headphone jack, in this case it's on the bottom of the phone. You get USB-C connectivity for data and power. The one point of interesting difference is with the SIM card tray. So the G34 5G is dual SIM capable, but not in the way that most phones do it. So for most phones, you get a dual SIM tray, but you get one straight nano SIM and then one tray which is typically either micro SD for storage expansion or a secondary nano SIM. That's not what the G34 does. Instead, it is single nano SIM for mobile data, and then micro SD only. It won't take a secondary SIM there. And the second actual SIM is an eSIM. Now, you just don't really see eSIM at the kind of prices that the Moto G34 sells for. And that's a big plus if you wanted a budget phone and you were, for example, planning on going traveling, because there's lots of really affordable, really good, really easy to configure travel eSIM companies out there these days. It's a great way to do your travel phone stuff without having to throw your existing SIM out of your phone and perhaps losing it while you're traveling. All those kinds of hassles, not an issue for this phone. Really nice inclusion there, especially at this price. On the camera front, the Motorola Moto G34 5G has a dual lens camera array at the rear, built primarily around a 50 megapixel wide sensor, paired up with a 2 megapixel macro lens, while at the front, in that hole punch array, you'll find a 16 megapixel sensor. Now, I feel like I've said this a lot. 2 megapixel macro lenses on mobile phones are generally rubbish. This is really no exception. Yeah, you can sometimes get kind of passable macro shots, but it's a lot of work, and most of what you get really won't look all that good at all. I kind of feel like every cheap Android phone maker had a meeting at some point and went, hey, let's all just buy up a stock of cheap macro lenses and chuck them on all our phones because it's so common, and they're just generally disappointing. The rest of the G34's camera performance isn't disappointing, it's just fine. It's basic, it's there, it works, and it has exactly the kind of issues that you'd expect out of a budget phone these days. So in normal light, you can get quite pleasing photos. In low light, it drops off the quality a bit. Some shots were a little bit more muted in color terms than I'd really like, and obviously stuff with fast action doesn't go all that well. But otherwise, this shoots okay for its price. If you want good camera, this is not the price range you should be playing in. You've really got to budget for a bit more still. It's nice to see what budget phones can do camera-wise these days, but this is still just an average camera phone at best. Motorola makes some interesting choices when it comes to its budget phones in terms of processors and specifications, because it bounces around between offering MediaTek and Qualcomm depending on the phone. For the Moto G34 5G, looking at a Qualcomm Snapdragon 695 here in Australia with 4GB of RAM and 128GB of onboard storage. I'm aware that there are some other variants in other markets that might bump up that RAM or bump down the storage, but that's what we get here down under. Now, 128GB of storage is nice to see at this price, although 4GB of RAM, yeah, that's on the lower side. That's going to affect your performance if you're multitasking or running more intensive apps. You'll probably see longer load times and some applications which will bump you down to lower settings just because of that RAM inclusion. It's worth noting, for example, the slightly more expensive G54 has 8GB of RAM, which is a lot more pleasing to see. But still, in benchmark terms, this did pretty well. Now, I've got a full text review because benchmark tables just don't present well on YouTube, but I've got a full text review which I'll throw the link into in the description below, so please do go look at that if you want to see how that compares against other Motorola phones and phones from Samsung. Basically, what you can get in this price bracket, I've got it all there in the text review. But the short form of it is CPU performance is decent for its price range. GPU performance actually a little bit better than I expected. It actually out-benchmarked, for example, the more expensive G54 and not by a small margin. Now, before you get too excited and think, hey, wow, great, cheap gaming phone, well, no. Look, this is still a budget phone. It's still going to work best, if gaming is your passion, with simpler Android gaming apps, your Match 3 puzzlers and the like. They're all fine, of course. More intensive titles will generally run, but typically at very low settings, and you won't, for example, get much of a benefit out of that 120Hz screen because a lot of them will pick, hey, no, this is quite low on RAM, quite low on processor. It can't handle those higher end graphics, even if it could display them at a nice, slick refresh rate. On the software side, it's an Android 14 phone with the promise of just one OS upgrade and 3 years worth of bi-monthly security updates. Now, glass half full, glass half empty situation here, I think. The G24 and lower only got security updates, no OS upgrades, so it's nice to see at least that, I suppose. At the same time, it'd be nice to see a little bit more in this space. I suppose it is better than some brands where you just get no promises of anything ever. It's nice for Motorola to be upfront about this, but I would still wish for a little bit more. Maybe that's just me. Let me know in the comments below. Motorola itself keeps its Android OS setup fairly clean. You just get a few tweaks like the predictable shaking and twisting actions for camera and flashlight, for example. And look, I prefer that cleaner style of Android, but this is Android. You can throw whatever launcher on it you like, make it look however you wish. It's nicely configurable. That is one of the good things about that particular mobile operating system. The Moto G34 5G is also 5G capable, predictably sub 6 GHz. This is not going to be Australia's next millimetre wave 5G phone, was never going to be. And look, network conditions can vary a lot. Here, testing in Sydney and Cairns, I hit my typical ranges of speed testing for this particular device. Around 200 to 400 meg down is kind of what I tend to get in those tests. It's pretty much exactly what I got with this phone. That I find is much more on network conditions than on the phones themselves. Worth noting, though, that if you are regional, it's not blue tick rated by Telstra, for example, so maybe not the strongest regional phone there. On the voice calling front, look, I've already said this a few other places, but I don't tend to say much about voice calling because the quality of voice calls is, again, a lot more network dependent, but this does okay. The speakers are pretty decent. They can get nice and loud if you need that, but I have no complaints, but that does not necessarily mean that you will have a flawless calling experience with this phone, but that's more to do with your network, I find. On the battery front, this has a 5,000 milliamp hour battery, and basically every Android phone, or nearly every Android phone, has a 5,000 milliamp hour battery, unless it's a little bit weird or unless it folds. And I've reviewed so many 5,000 milliamp hour battery phones that it led me to a moment of madness where I got an AI service to generate a song about how dull it is that Android phones have 5,000 milliamp hour batteries. I'll throw a link into that in the description below, but warning, it's a song. I didn't say it was a good song. But, as I say, this has a 5,000 milliamp hour battery. It led me to songsmithing, but it also led me to testing its battery capacity, because that's actually what's more important with this argument. It's not, oh, it's got a nice big number. It's, what can it actually do? And here, first of all, I threw it at my standard YouTube battery test. So that's an hour's worth of YouTube video, maximum brightness, moderate volume. In this case, 720p only, because that's what the screen will do. And it did okay, dropped about 7% of its battery life. Now, some other phones in this price bracket do a little bit better on that test, but what I really look for there is to make sure that a phone doesn't drop to 90% or below, because that's usually the sign of a phone that won't last out a full day. This typically will. Now, look, if I throw lots of heavy apps at any phone, it can die within a day, for sure. But for most moderate usage, this is going to be fine. So is it worth buying the Motorola Moto G34 5G? Well, look, at $279 Australian, it's a decent buy. The G54 sits in an interesting position relative to it. This will actually be updated a little bit longer than the 54 will, I think. And the pricing gets a little bit challenging there, especially, and this is rather Australia specific, because Telstra is also ranging this particular phone as a prepaid phone at $229, quite a bit cheaper. Now, the catch there appears to be that it is locked to the Telstra network, so you've got to either have it on their network for 2 years for a free unlock, or at least 6 months for a $25 unlock. But other than that, if you were going to be using them as your telco anyway, that's a pretty solid deal. And at that $229 price, it's a really interesting comparison against the G54. Where that, of course, also gets interesting is Android phones drop price all the time. Specials happen all the time. So definitely shop around for this one, because $279, it's pretty good. At $229, it's really very good. It's probably the best $229 phone you can buy right now, as long as you can live either with that network locking condition, or if you can find it nice and cheap in a sale. Anyway, that's my take on the Motorola Moto G34 5G. What do you think? Got any questions? Hit me up in the comments below, and as always, thanks for watching, and don't forget to hit like and subscribe.
In this digital world where batteries reign, every Android phone, they're all the same.